Through the Desert by Henryk Sienkiewicz. Thank you for every activity under the video. It really helps. Chapter 43. At his cries, Kali came running up, and after him the two men who were to relieve the guards, and then all the Wahimas and Samburus assembled, howling and roaring around the place where the crime had been committed. The greatest noise and confusion ensued, the underlying keynote being one of fear. The Negroes were not so much disturbed on account of the men having been murdered and a crime committed as they were at having lost their last drop of water, now absorbed by the parched earth of the jungle. Several threw themselves on the ground and pulled up lumps of earth with their fingers and sucked out the remaining moisture. Others cried that wicked spirits had killed the guards and slit the bags. But Staś and Kali knew how much credit to give to these tales. Mkunji and Mpua were missing from the howling throng. More than the murder of two guards and the theft of water had taken place. The water bags left behind, having been torn, proved that it was done for revenge. It meant death for the whole caravan. The priests of the wicked Mshimu had taken revenge on the good Mshimu. The sorcerers had taken revenge on the young king because he had brought their deceptions to light and had not permitted them to continue deceiving the stupid Wahimas. But now death hovered over the caravan like a hawk over a flock of doves. Kali remembered, when it was too late, that he had been so sad and also so busy that he had forgotten to have the sorcerers bound, as he had done every evening since their attempt to escape. It was also evident that the two Negroes guarding the water had lain down and gone to sleep with the inherent thoughtlessness of their race. This had made the work of the villains easy and permitted them to escape unpunished. Quite a time elapsed before the excitement subsided and the party recovered from its dismay. The evildoers could not as yet have gotten far away, for the ground under the slit bags was damp and the blood of the murdered guards was not quite dry. Staś ordered the fugitives to be pursued, not with the sole purpose of punishing them, but also to recover the last two water bags. Kali immediately mounted a horse and with several riflemen started in pursuit. It occurred to Staś, who had first thought of accompanying them, that because of the excitement and the disturbed state of the Negroes, he could not possibly leave Nell alone with them, so he remained behind, but he ordered Kali to take Saba with him. He was greatly afraid there would be an uprising, and he felt sure that the Samburus would revolt. But in this he was mistaken. Negroes are given to revolt, and sometimes even for trivial reasons, but when overpowered by misfortune, and especially when the merciless hand of death weighs heavily on them, they yield without making any attempt at resistance. This applies not only to those whom Islam has taught that it is useless to struggle against fate, but to all without exception. Then neither fear nor the agony of their last moments can awaken them from their lethargy. This was the case now. As soon as the first excitement was over, and the Wahimas and the Samburus realized that they must eventually die, they lay down quietly on the ground to wait for death. Therefore, no rebellion was to be expected. On the contrary, it was doubtful if they would get up the following morning and be willing to continue the journey. Staś felt deeply sorry for them. Kali returned before daybreak and immediately placed in front of Staś two torn bags in which not a drop of water remained. "Great man," he said, "Mahdi, apana!" Staś wiped his forehead, which was streaming with perspiration from fright and worry. Then he asked, "And Mkunji and Mpua?" "Mkunji and Mpua are dead," answered Kali. "You have killed them. Lion or Wobo killed them," and he began to relate what had happened. They found the corpses of the two criminals at quite a distance from the camp, where they had been killed. They lay side by side. Both had had their skulls crushed in from behind, their shoulders torn, and their backs eaten. Kali conjectured that a Wobo or a lion had appeared before them in the moonlight, and that they had fallen on their faces to beseech it to spare their lives. But the terrible beast had killed them both. Then, having satisfied its appetite, it scented the water and tore the bags to pieces. "God has punished them," said Staś, "and the Wahimas will now be convinced that the wicked Mshimu can save no one." And Kali repeated, "God has punished them, but we have no water. Ahead of us, far off toward the east, I have seen mountains. There must be water there. Kali has also seen them, but to get to them are many, many days. A short silence ensued. "Sir," said Kali, "good Msimu Bibi should pray to the Great Spirit for rain or for a stream of water." Staś made no reply, but moved away. He saw Nell's little white figure in front of the tent, for the screams and howls of the Negroes had awakened her some time before. "Staś, what has happened?" she asked, hurrying toward him. He laid his hand on her little head and said gravely, "Nell, pray to God for water, or we are all doomed to die." And so the little girl raised her small pale face to heaven. Fixing her eyes on the silver disk of the moon, she prayed for deliverance to him who in heaven guides the stars, and on earth tempers the wind to the shorn lamb. After a sleepless, noisy, and distracted night, the sun appeared on the horizon with the suddenness that prevails only at the equator. At once it was bright daylight. Not a drop of dew on the grass, not a cloud in the sky. Staś ordered the riflemen to gather the Negroes together, and he addressed a few words to them. He explained that it was impossible to return to the river, for they knew full well that they were 5 days or 5 nights' journey from it. But on the other hand, no one could tell whether they might not find water in the opposite direction. In their immediate neighborhood a spring, a tiny stream, or a pool might be found, for although no trees could be seen, it often happens that on open plains where seeds are blown away by hurricanes there is water, though no trees. The day before they had seen several large antelope and ostriches running eastward, which was a sign that there must be a watering place somewhere in that direction. Therefore, anyone not a fool or chicken-hearted, but having a brave heart like the lion and buffalo, would prefer to march on, even though suffering tortures from thirst, rather than to remain lying on the ground waiting for the hawks and hyenas to devour them. At these words, he pointed with his hand to some hawks flying in circles over the caravan, the harbingers of disaster. Nearly all the Wahimas, whom Kali had ordered to arise, stood up when they heard these words. Being accustomed to despotic rule, they did not dare to show the least resistance. Many of the Samburus, however, because their king Faru had remained behind at the lake, did not want to get up again, and they said to one another, "Why should we seek death when death is seeking us?" Thus the caravan, now reduced by nearly 1/2, broke camp, and even this exertion caused the men much torture and pain. For 24 hours no one had tasted a drop of water or any other liquid. Even in a cooler climate this would have caused most acute suffering, and what must it mean to these, now laboring in this African furnace, in which, even if water be drunk in plenty, the perspiration follows so rapidly that one can wipe it off his skin almost the same moment it is swallowed. It was certain that many of the party would collapse by the way from exhaustion and sunstroke. Staś protected Nell from the sun as best he could, and would not allow her for a second to put her head out of the palanquin, the roof of which, by the way, he had covered with a piece of white percale to make it a double protection against the blighting rays. He used the water still remaining in the rubber bag to make some strong tea and served it to her without sugar, because sweets increase thirst. The girl pleaded with tears in her eyes for him to drink too, and at last he put the bottle, in which scarcely a few thimblefuls of water remained, to his lips, and moving his throat, pretended to drink. At the same moment, as he felt the touch of moisture on his lips, it seemed to him as though a flame were burning in his chest and stomach, and that if he could not extinguish it, he would drop dead. Red circles began to glimmer before his eyes. Terrible stinging pains shot through his jaw as of 1,000 needles. His hand trembled so that he came near spilling the last precious drops, but he only moistened his tongue and reserved the rest for Nell. Another day of suffering and fatigue ensued, which was fortunately followed by a cool night. The next morning the burning heat again beat down, and not a breath of air was stirring. The sun, like a spirit of evil, devastated the parched soil with its deadly fire. The edge of the sky down near the horizon was a pale hue, and as far as the eye could reach, not even a bush could be seen. Nothing, only a burned desert plain, covered with tufts of blackened grass and heather. Occasionally a slight rumble of thunder was heard in the far distance, but coming from a clear sky it was a sign of drought, not of rain. At noon, when the heat was at its worst, it became necessary to halt. The caravan rested in gloomy silence. 2 horses had dropped down, and a number of Negroes had fallen behind. During this rest, no one thought about eating. The eyes of all were sunken, their lips cracked, and on them were dried clots of blood. Nell gasped like a languid little bird, so Staś handed her 2 rubber bags, and crying out, "I have drunk, I have drunk," ran toward the other side of the camp, fearing that if he remained he would take the water away from her or ask her to share it with him. Perhaps this was the most heroic thing he had done during the entire journey. His sufferings increased under these tortures. Red circles continually glimmered before his eyes. Such a terrible pressure was in his jaws that he could open and shut them only with difficulty. His throat was parched and feverishly hot. There was no saliva in his mouth, and his tongue was dry as wood. But this was only the beginning of the torture for him and for the caravan. The rumbling of thunder near the horizon, a sign of drought, continued. About 3 o'clock, when the sun turned toward the western side of the heavens, Staś ordered the caravan to march. He placed himself at its head and led it toward the east. He had now scarcely 70 men, and now and then one of these would lie down beside his burden, never to rise again. The thermometer went down a few degrees, but even then it was murderously hot. The motionless air was filled with suffocating humidity, and they could scarcely breathe. The animals also suffered. Saba's sides heaved up and down, and he panted laboriously. Not a drop of froth fell from his tongue, which was black and hanging out of his mouth. King, who was used to the dry African jungle, did not seem to suffer much, but still he began to be troublesome. A strange light shone in his tiny eyes. He still answered Staś, and especially Nell, who occasionally talked to him with a grunt. But when Kali thoughtlessly passed him by, King snorted threateningly and waved his trunk so frantically that the boy would probably have been killed had he not sprung quickly aside. Kali's eyes were bloodshot, the veins of his throat were swollen, and his lips were cracked like those of the other Negroes. Toward 5 o'clock he approached Staś, and with great difficulty moved his throat sufficiently to say in a hollow voice, "Great man, Kali can go no farther. He will stay here for the night." Staś controlled the pain in his jaw and answered with difficulty, "All right, let us halt. The night will bring relief." "It will bring death," whispered the young Negro. The Negroes threw down the burdens, but they did not lie down immediately, as the fever, which had thickened their blood, was now at its height. Their hearts and the pulses in hands and feet beat so heavily that it seemed they must burst. The skin on their bodies, dry and shriveled, began to itch. In their bones they felt an intense restlessness, and a fiery heat seemed to consume their throats and intestines. Many walked restlessly up and down between the piles of baggage. By the rays of the dying sun, others, farther away, could be seen, following each other among the parched bushes until their strength was utterly exhausted. Then one by one they fell to the ground, not resting quietly, but twitching more spasmodically than before. Kali sat down, in Turkish fashion, next to Staś and Nell, with his mouth open and gasping for air. Between breaths he begged beseechingly, "Bwana kubwa, water!" Staś looked at him with a glassy stare and was silent. "Bwana kubwa, water!" and after a while, "Kali die!" Therefore Mia, who for some reason was able to bear the thirst better than anyone else, sat down beside him, and putting her arms around his neck, said in a soft, melodious voice, "Mia will die along with Kali." A long pause ensued. Meanwhile the sun went down, and the night clothed the landscape in darkness. The heavens became dark blue. In the southern sky shone the cross. Over the plain glittered myriads of stars. The moon rose, and its light pervaded the darkness, and in the west the pale twilight of the zodiac spread far and wide. The atmosphere became a huge glittering flood. An even more brilliant glow spread over the landscape. The palanquin, which they forgot to remove from King's back, and the tents shone as if made of white marble. The world sank into death-like silence. Sleep enveloped the earth. And in the midst of nature's tranquil peacefulness, Staś and his followers writhed in pain, waiting for death. On the silver background of the twilight, the huge form of the elephant stood out distinctly. The moonlight illuminated the tent, Staś's and Nell's white clothes, the spaces between the bushes of heather, the dark, cramped, and distorted bodies of the Negroes and the baggage-strewn ground. Saba sat on his hind legs in front of the children, and howled sadly with head turned toward the moon. Not a thought was left in the soul of Staś, nothing but dumb despair. He felt there was no help, no way out, that all their terrible fatigue and hardships, all the sufferings and courageous deeds done on the terrible journey, from Medinet to Khartoum, from Khartoum to Fashoda, from Fashoda to the unknown lake, had been utterly useless, and that they could not escape the inexorable end of the struggle, death. It appeared all the more dreadful to him since it would come on the last stretch of the journey, at whose end lay the ocean. Oh, he could never take Nell to the coast, nor put her on the ship for Port Said. He could never give her back to her father, nor fall into his father's arms and hear him say that he had acted like a brave boy and a true Pole. It was all over. In a few days the sun would shine, but on lifeless bodies. Then it would dry them up like the mummies that sleep the everlasting sleep in Egyptian museums. His brain was turning from the pain and heat and fever. He saw visions of death struggles, and there came to him strange sounds. He distinctly heard the voices of the Sudanese and the Bedouins crying, "Yalla, yalla!" as they mercilessly whipped their frightened camels. He saw Idris and Geber. The Mahdi smiled at him with his thick lips and asked, "Will you drink of the fountain of truth?" A lion standing on a rock gazed at him. Then Linda gave him a jar of quinine and said, "Make haste, for the little one is dying." Then he only saw a pale, sweet little face and two little hands stretched toward him. Suddenly he shuddered. For a moment consciousness came back to him, close to his ear. Nell's soft, sad, pleading voice whispered, "Staś, water!" She, as did Kali, rested her hope on him. But as he had given her the last drops of water 12 hours before, he now controlled himself and cried out with a voice full of emotion, pain, and despair. "Oh, Nell, I only pretended to drink. For the last 3 days I have not tasted a drop." And holding his head in despair, he ran away that he might not see how she suffered. Blindly up and down between the tufts of grass and heather he ran, until his strength was utterly exhausted and he sank down on one of the bushes. No weapon of any kind was in his hand. A leopard, lion, or even a large hyena would have found him easy prey. But only Saba came running up, sniffing at him and howling, as if he too were asking for help. No one came to their assistance. Only the calm, indifferent moon looked down upon them from above. For a long time the boy lay as if lifeless, when a cooler breath of wind, unexpectedly blowing from the east, restored him to his senses. He raised himself and tried to stand and go to Nell. Now there blew another cool breath of wind. Saba ceased to howl, turned toward the east, and began to expand his nostrils. Suddenly he barked once in a sharp bass tone, and then a second time, and ran on straight ahead. For a time he seemed to be silent, but soon his bark was heard in the distance. Staś stood up, and staggering about on his benumbed legs, looked in the direction taken by Saba. The lengthy journeys, the long sojourn in the jungle, the necessity of keeping all his senses strung up to their highest pitch, and the incessant dangers he had encountered, had taught the boy to observe everything that was going on about him. And so, notwithstanding the tortures he suffered at the moment, and though he was only semi-conscious, he began from instinct to note the movements of the dog. After a while Saba returned, but he seemed disturbed and very restless. Several times he looked up at Staś, walked around him, ran away in the heather sniffing and barking, and again returned, and at last taking hold of the boy's clothes, he began to drag him toward the opposite side of the camp. Staś had now fully regained his presence of mind. "What is that?" he thought. "Either the dog has gone mad from thirst or he has scented water. But no, if there were water nearby he would have run there to drink and his throat would be wet. But if the water be far off he has not scented it, for water has no scent. He is not pulling me towards some kind of prey, for this evening he refused to eat. Then what can it mean?" And suddenly his heart began to beat faster in his breast. Perhaps the wind has brought him the scent of human beings? Perhaps there is a Negro village in the distance. Perhaps one of the kites. Oh, merciful Jesus! Oh, Jesus! A faint ray of hope spurred him on. He felt stronger and tried to run toward the camp, in spite of the resistance of the dog, who continually barred the way. From the camp Nell's white form shone out, and her weak voice reached him. Soon afterward he stumbled over Kali lying on the ground, but he took no heed of anything. Reaching the piece of baggage in which the rockets were kept, he tore it open, took one out, with trembling hands bound it to a bamboo post, pushed it into the earth, and lighted the fuse. Soon a red snake shot up, spluttering noisily into the air. Staś caught hold of the bamboo rod with both hands to prevent himself from falling, and gazed fixedly into the distance. The pulses in his hands and temples beat hard, and his lips moved in fervent prayer. He felt that in this his last breath his heart was calling on heaven for help. A second, a third, a fourth minute elapsed. Nothing, and again nothing. The boy's hands fell at his side, his head sank to the ground, and dreadful pain filled his tortured breast. In vain, he moaned. I shall go and sit down by Nell, and we shall die together. At the same moment, far, far off in the silvery background of the moonlit night, a fiery streak rose into the air and broke into golden stars, which slowly fell to the ground like large tears. "We are saved!" cried Staś. Then the people, half dead but a moment ago, sprang up, running to and fro, jumping over the grass and tufts of heather. After the first rocket, a second and a third were sent up. Then a gust of wind brought the echo of a peculiar cracking sound, very evidently caused by distant shots. In reply, Staś ordered all the rifles fired off, and from that time the guns answered each other without intermission, and the noises became more and more distinct. The boy now mounted a horse, which also had, as if by a miracle, regained some strength, and holding Nell before him, galloped over the plain toward the sound of deliverance. Saba ran alongside, and behind him tramped the huge king. The two camps were several kilometers apart, but each party was hurrying toward the other, and so the ride was not a long one. The flashes from the guns could now be seen. Another rocket, the last, arose in the air, at a distance of not more than several 100 feet away. Then numerous lights shone. A slight swell of the ground hid them for a while, but when Staś mounted it, he found himself face to face with a line of Negroes holding burning torches in their hands. At the head of the line marched 2 Europeans wearing English helmets and carrying guns. At a glance, Staś recognized Captain Glenn and Dr. Clary.
Remember to subscribe.